The Dreams of Joseph. Before this story, we learned how Jacob's daughter Dinah was assaulted, raped, and then taken as a wife by Shechem. Out of vengeance, Simon and Levi killed every man in the small city and pillaged all they had. Jacob fled back to Bethel and settled there with his family, and God reassured Jacob of his promise. Now we will learn about how Jacob, now called Israel, favored his youngest son Joseph. Joseph's favor from his father would bring contempt from his brothers, inspired by the book of Genesis. Jacob, now called Israel, lived in the land promised by God to Abraham. In the land of Canaan he dwelled with his family, increasing in influence and blessings. The land was ripe with green fields and fresh soil. Flocks thrived and grew in number, and the sons of Israel all worked for their father and began raising families of their own. Joseph, who was the youngest brother at 17 years old, often pastured the flock with his brothers. It was not rare for Joseph to bring reports back to his father about anything his brothers did wrong, for he was Israel's favorite, and he knew it. Israel loved Joseph deeply, not just because he was the youngest, but he was also the son of Rachel, who could not have children before him. One day Israel adorned Joseph with an immaculate robe. It flowed and glistened in the sun. Its colors beamed with regality, and clearly represented where Joseph stood among the rest of his 11 brothers. It was evident to his brothers how much their father loved him more, so they hated Joseph for it. It was nearly impossible for them to speak to him without contempt in their voices. One evening, Joseph tossed and turned in the night from a vivid dream. Joseph awoke and immediately went to tell his brothers about what he had seen. "Hear my dream," he asked while they were getting ready to work the fields. "We were all binding sheaves of wheat in the field, and all of a sudden my sheaf rose and stood upright. Your sheaves all gathered around mine and bowed to it." Joseph recounted his dream to his brothers, and they all stared at him, irked. "So are you to reign and rule over us?" they asked with disdain. They hated him for his dreams. Joseph one day would learn how to explain dreams with less pride, but for now he reveled in the idea of his brothers bowing to him. The next night he dreamed another dream just as vivid as the one before. Again he spoke to his brothers in the morning. "Behold, the sun and the moon, and 11 stars were all bowing down to me," he told them. This time, it was not only his brothers, but his mother and father as well that bowed to him. This annoyed his brothers as well as Israel. Israel rebuked Joseph and said, "What kind of dreams have you been having? Shall we all fall on the ground before you?" Though Israel was cross, he pondered what his son's dreams may have meant. The other brothers, however, were jealous and teemed with anger more and more every day. One day his brothers went to pasture their father's flocks near the valley of Shechem. Israel decided to send Joseph to help and bring word of how they were doing. Joseph left Hebron and came to Shechem, but could not find his brothers anywhere. Joseph found a man wandering the fields and asked if he had seen his brothers with the flocks. "They have gone away. I heard them say they would go to Dothan," the man replied. So Joseph set out to find his brothers at Dothan. As Joseph descended down into Dothan, his brothers saw him from afar. "Here comes the dreamer," one of them said. "We should kill him and throw him into one of these pits. We will see what comes of his dreams when he is devoured by a beast," another said. They laughed, but Reuben, the oldest, was not liking where the conversation was headed. Reuben did not want his brother dead, but he also feared the backlash if he defended Joseph. "Let's not take his life," Reuben said. "Shedding blood is too messy." Instead, we should just throw him in this pit here and let him rot." Reuben suggested this so he could come by later to rescue Joseph. Joseph finally arrived and greeted his brothers. He was met with piercing glares. They had looked at him with disdain before, but this time it was different. Their eyes portrayed an ancient evil that had lurked in the hearts of men since the beginning. All 11 brothers looked at him with the eyes of Cain. Before Joseph could process what was happening, he found himself trapped under the arms of his older brothers. Strong and calloused from tilling the fields and harvesting grain year after year, their hands clutched his colorful robe and tore it off his body. A fury of chuckles and blows blurred Joseph's vision. He was caught in a mob of anger and hate. Covering his head and face from the fists of his brothers, Joseph could barely look up until he found himself in the air, descending into a deep pit below. All the air in Joseph's lungs fled as his back hit the cold, damp ground. Lying face up, he slowly opened his eyes, only to see the mocking stares of his brothers looking down on him. Joseph lay there helpless for hours. It seemed like days. The only water in the pit fell from Joseph's eyes. Afraid and alone, Joseph wept. Later that day, as they sat down to eat, the brothers saw a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants heading to Egypt to sell their goods and slaves. Judah saw them from afar and then turned towards his brothers and said, "What does it profit us to kill our brother? The only thing we gain is having to clean up his blood. Why don't we sell him to the Ishmaelites? He is our brother, after all." The brothers listened intently. Joseph awoke still in the darkness. He had huddled into the corner of the pit to block himself from the piercing sun. Silhouetted from the base of the pit, Joseph saw a rope fall towards him. Finally, his brothers had ceased their cruel joke and rescued him. Joseph climbed out of the pit, looked towards his brothers, and was immediately tackled to the floor, shackled, and taken away towards Egypt. With the sun beginning to set behind him, Joseph turned his head towards Canaan. Joseph's dreams seemed to be more fantasy now than they ever had been. His heart was tortured by the rejection of his brothers. Joseph, Israel's prized son, was now a slave. Reuben, who had left while everything had transpired, finally returned to the pit to free Joseph. He looked down and saw that Joseph was gone. Reuben, frantic and concerned for Joseph, tore his clothes and raced to his other brothers. "He's gone!" Reuben shouted. Reuben's weak attempt at bravery failed. It was him who would have to tell his father what happened. The brothers took Joseph's robe, the only remaining trace of him. They slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's robe in the blood. With fake sobs and worried eyes, they went to their father with the robe. Heads held low in perfect theatrics, they said, "We have found this. Is this your son's robe?" Israel, with tears welling up in his eyes, said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal must have devoured him." He tore his clothes and mourned for weeks. His sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused. "I shall take my grief down to Sheol. There is no returning from this." The approval the brothers once craved would not be given just because Joseph was gone. More now than ever, their father was distant. Meanwhile, in the hot Egyptian sun, Joseph stood, heat beating down on his face, back torn apart from whips, and a spirit broken by his brothers. Joseph was put on display to be sold. The Midianites then sold him to Potiphar, an officer to Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. There, Joseph's story would start to begin.